My name is David Lindeman. I direct our health initiative here at Citrus. Welcome everyone today, not only those of you who are here joining us for the presentation, but our colleagues at Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz. Always delighted to have you join us virtually. Today we are also taking questions as part of the program. So you can submit them live on Twitter, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the talk. Hashtag CitrusRE, if you would like to use those, and we'll follow those. And again, we'll be available as our distinguished presenter will finish. We'll be doing questions and answers throughout the afternoon. And again, those of you who are here, you know that we're green friendly, so everything is compostable. We appreciate you being able to put everything in the back in our recyclable containers. Several announcements. We have several upcoming events. We're very excited because our Citrus Foundry, which you may not know, has been expanding, and we have more space now up on our 4th floor here and more capacity for companies who are very interested in working with Citrus. It has announced its application program, which is now out, with a due date of October 27th. So prospective applicants can go to the citrusfoundry.org for more information, and a number of our colleagues are here today who you'd be able to speak with regarding the Foundry, and you're going to hear from our speaker today who has benefited from this wonderful program that we have. On November 30th, we're going to be having 2 fantastic programs, Women in Tech Symposium on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and we're going to have the WITI at UC Athena Awards down at our UC Santa Cruz Silicon Valley campus in Santa Clara. So those who can get there, we would welcome you. It's going to be a wonderful program. And this semester's research exchange, as you know, we continue every Wednesday at noon. You can get the additional program at citrus.eventbrite.com to stay up to date on our forthcoming programs. So with that, I'd like to turn to today's program. I'm very honored and pleased to have Dr. Neil Ray join us. Neil is not only a Harvard-trained, board-certified pediatric anesthesiologist who has done tremendous work up at the UC Davis Health Med Center, but he has also now become he's done a trifecta here at Citrus. He is the founder of Raydiant Oximetry, a medical device startup company that is focusing on fetal monitoring and improving outcomes for mothers and babies in a very innovative, non-invasive way. Dr. Ray is first a recipient of one of our Citrus Seed Fund grants, which helped start his work in this area, and he subsequently was able to get a SBIR NIH grant for his non-invasive fetal oximeter work to be used during labor and delivery. So again, has really taken this on a wonderful trajectory. But subsequently, and one of the things that we're proud of and we like to highlight that Citrus is able to do, we were able to sponsor his clinical trial work to test the feasibility of this innovative, disruptive technology, which is required. And he's going to speak to us today about some of the FDA issues and points around doing how we can be of support and help our colleagues, our researchers, clinicians in this space. And he was able to very rapidly move his program forward. But finally, again, Raydiant Oximetry participated in our foundry, in our incubator over the past year, and he recently graduated. So you are going to be hearing about a person who's not only maximized the impact of Citrus, but has taken this to whole new levels. Raydiant Oximetry is now in residence at the Fogarty Institute for Innovation down in Mountain View. Fogarty Institute is the premier medical device accelerator in the Bay Area. It's quite a distinguished opportunity to be part of that. They have mentored only 24 companies in the past 10 years. Over half of them have successfully exited. So the first Fogarty company was HeartFlow, which is quite well known, and they are currently valued at $1.2 billion. So Neil is a distinguished company. He has, again, done spectacular work. You are in for a treat to see the updates that he's provided, and we couldn't be prouder to host you today. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave, for that really kind introduction. My name is Neil Ray. I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist based out of Sacramento, California, and I'm the founder of Raydiant Oximetry. I'm proud to be here with Citrus. It was only 18 months ago that my company was just an idea on a napkin. So it's been a whirlwind and a lot of fun. So a couple of things I want to talk about today are the history of fetal monitoring. Why do we monitor the baby during labor and delivery? And what monitors do we use? And what's wrong with the monitors that we're using? And why have C-section rates been on the rise? And what are the consequences of C-section rates from an economic perspective and a clinical perspective? And then I want to talk a little bit about the alternatives to current fetal monitors that have been developed and some of the work that we are working on at Raydiant Oximetry to improve on fetal monitoring. Before I do that, I do have two disclosures to make. I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist and I put people asleep for a living, but I hope I won't be doing that today during lunch. And the second thing is I do have a financial interest in this company and in this space. So my conversation with you today might be perceived as bias. So why do we monitor fetuses? We've been monitoring fetuses since the time of the Egyptians. And if you see this device here, this is called a fetoscope. It's basically an amplifier to listen to the baby. Not only does listening to the baby get people excited, but there must be some value. There must have been some value for the Egyptians to do it. There must have been some value for clinicians to do it 100 years ago. And the reason why they did it is very different than the reason why we do it today. What they were doing fetal monitoring for was to map out the position of the baby, because certain positions were associated with a complicated delivery and a high likelihood that mom was going to die. So they wanted to know which mothers were in for a difficult childbirth and which babies were probably not going to survive the childbirth. So they were listening to the heart to map out the orientation of the baby. Were they breech? Were they vertex? Was the head up? Was the head down? Where was the placenta? And that's very different than what we are doing today for fetal monitoring. So it wasn't until 1833 that Dr. Kennedy recommended intermittent auscultation as a tool for intrapartum detection of fetal distress. So not only did they learn in the 1800s that fetal monitoring could be used to map out the anatomy of the baby, but that actually the heart sounds could be predictive of fetal distress. And it was in 1893 that Dr. von Winkel established the following criteria that could be suggestive of fetal distress. Perhaps the baby's heart rate was fast, over 160 beats per minute. Perhaps the baby's heart rate was slow, less than 100 beats per minute. Perhaps the heart rate was irregular. Perhaps the baby had passed meconium. Meconium is stool. When the baby's stressed, they start stooling, and the amniotic fluid goes from being clear to being murky. And then maybe the baby stopped moving. All these criteria, which are still valid today in 2017, were first described by Dr. Van Winkel as potentially predicting which babies were in distress and which ones were not. How about the C-section? Where did that come from? C-sections were first described under Roman times, under Caesar, who declared that all women who are ill-fated during childbirth must be cut open. And that's how the term Cesarean came about. And so here are some paintings from the 1500s that show last-ditch efforts to save babies from women who have passed or dying during childbirth. And so the Cesarean's been around a long time, just like the original fetal monitoring. But there is a historical context that's not so pleasant to talk about with C-sections. People thought that the pain of childbirth was a biblical injunction that women should sorrow to bring forth children in atonement for Eve's sins. And so when you look at the care that women had historically received and the care that was available for men, there was a huge disparity. Anesthesia was discovered in 1846, but it wasn't being used until 30 years after for C-sections. It was expected that women get C-sections and go through childbirth without pain relief because of these disparities that existed in the way they thought about healthcare. Now let's fast forward to the 1950s. Fetal Doppler was first invented in 1958. And I don't know if anyone's ever gone on Amazon to look at a fetal Doppler, but now it costs $20 and it's about the size of an iPhone. And this is the first fetal Doppler. Look at this big machine that could tell you the baby's heart rate. And that revolutionized the care of obstetrics, because from Doppler came ultrasound. And with ultrasound, we could map out the baby's position, map out the placenta's position, and we could make a more definitive assessment in terms of which labors were going to be complicated and which ones were not. And it was in 1958 that Dr. Hans described fetal heart rate patterns from Doppler that were associated with cerebral palsy and stillborn births. Then in 1964, Dr. Callaghan was the first that described a commercially viable Doppler system that would do continuous fetal heart rate monitoring. Remember, before this, they were doing intermittent heart rate monitoring, maybe every 10 minutes, maybe every hour, but never continuous. Continuous started in 1964. And then in 1968, Oximetry, a German company, launched the first fetal heart rate monitor in the United States. That company was bought by Hewlett-Packard. And this is what a fetal monitor looks like, and it's essentially the same exact technology that was invented in 1968. There's been zero innovation in fetal heart rate monitoring since 1968. Today, if you go to the hospital, you'll use the same exact function of a fetal heart rate monitor that was used back then. So what's the problem with fetal heart rate monitoring? It's been around for a long time, so it must be good, right? Anything like aspirin. Aspirin's been around for a long time, so it's withstood the test of time. But that's not the situation with fetal heart rate monitors. Electronic fetal heart rate monitoring is extremely subjective to interpretation. If you were to ask 5 obstetric providers what they thought of a tracing, only 2 of the 5 would agree with themselves. And if you ask the same provider a year later what they think of a tracing, they only agree with themselves 80% of the time. So the problem with this technology is it's very highly subjective to interpretation, and it leads to consequences that have lifelong implications. And what I have here circled is what we call a fetal deceleration. Now this deceleration means that the baby's heart rate drops when the mom's contraction occurs. And if you were to ask 10 obstetricians, 5 would say this is normal, and 5 would say this is concerning. And depending on where you go, which hospital you go to, and who your obstetrician is, it could be a very different pathway in terms of how your baby ends up getting delivered. So because of this situation, in 1997, the NIH attempted to standardize fetal heart rate monitoring in terms of putting it into a category and suggesting what the implications of that category were. And they came up with 3 categories. Category 1, which is essentially normal, healthy, no problems at all. But the problem with category 1 is it only happens 10% of the time. We wish it happened more often, but it doesn't. It only happens 10% of the time. And then there's category 3, which happens 5% of the time. And that's really bad. That means you need to have a C-section right away. And that happens 5% of the time. But now you have 85% of women who are undergoing a trial of labor. They're put on the fetal monitor, and they have what are called category 2 tracings. And these are indeterminate. We don't know if they're okay. We don't know if they're bad. There's a little bit of clinical judgment involved, and it makes it really hard for an obstetrician in the setting of a category 2 fetal heart rate tracing to know what's going on. But then when you look at the consequences of category 2 fetal heart rate tracings, 98% of those babies that ended up getting a C-section were just fine. And when I say they're just fine, I mean they didn't have acidosis. Acidosis is something that happens when the baby doesn't have enough oxygen, so they start undergoing anaerobic metabolism. They build up lactic acid, and that makes the blood acidotic. So 98% of babies that had fetal heart rate tracings of category 2 were just fine upon C-section. And 99.8% of those babies did not have cerebral palsy. So an incredibly high amount of these babies are just fine. But we just don't know that beforehand. And because the consequences are so dire of waiting and potentially missing a baby that's developing neurological injury, the gut instinct is to do a C-section on everyone. But that has implications clinically and economically. And so as a result of this new category that was developed by the NIH in 1997, Fetal heart rate monitoring has been associated with an 89% false positive rate for predicting fetal distress. That doesn't sound very good, right? A coin toss here is a lot more accurate than these monitors. Then when you look at all the reasons why women get C-sections, I'm talking about first-time mothers. Some will definitely need a C-section. There's a strong medical reason. Let's say they have twins. Let's say the baby's breech. Let's say the baby's big. Let's say the mom has a heart condition where if she were to undergo labor, it could be bad for her heart. There are legitimate reasons for why women get C-sections. But if you look at the biggest reason, it's for this condition called non-reassuring fetal heart rate tracing. 32%. A third of first-time mothers will get C-sections for abnormal fetal heart rate tracings. And if you look since 1980 in the United States, C-section rates have increased fourfold to where now 1 in every 3 women will get a C-section delivery. But if you look at outcomes for the baby in terms of neurological injury, nothing's changed. That rate has remained essentially flat. So we're doing all this intervention, we're putting all this money into healthcare without improving outcomes. So there's a disconnect here, as I'm sure all of you would agree. Something has to be done about this. And childbirth is a lot more expensive than people realize. C-sections are the #1 procedure performed in the United States. They drive up healthcare costs. And so childbirth is more expensive than inpatient cardiac care, inpatient cancer care, and inpatient trauma care. And this problem isn't just a United States problem, it's a worldwide problem. Canada's, such as Mexico, Greece, China, Ireland, India, Australia, are all dealing with C-section rates that are unsustainably high. If you look at all the C-section rates in the United States, all the hospitals, 60% of them have been deemed to have C-section rates that are too high. Health and Human Services came out with a mandate in the year 2020 for hospitals to reduce their C-section rates below 24%. And today, 60% of hospitals have rates that are higher than that mandate. Only 40% fulfill it. And because C-section rates are so expensive, insurance companies like Covered California plan to exclude hospitals with high C-section rates from their network. So hospitals have to soon figure out a way how they're going to reduce their C-section rates in a way that's safe and also complies with these mandates that are coming up. When you look at C-sections and their impact, not only is there a clinical, but there's also an economic consequence to the procedures. And whether you're a mother, baby, hospital, or employer, these procedures can affect your bottom line. When you look at mothers are more likely to have issues with blood transfusions, infections, injury to the bowel, injury to the bladder, blood clots. Recovery time increases, and there's a 90% increase in repeat C-section rates once you've had your first C-section. People don't realize that there's a 4-fold increase in death to mothers from C-sections and about a 100-fold increase in surgical complication from C-sections. So clearly there's a value to the mom's health to reduce unnecessary C-section rates. When it comes to babies that are born through C-section have a higher incidence of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, in the first year of life. They also have a higher incidence of asthma. Babies are born, when they're born by a C-section, they have amniotic fluid in their lungs, and that fluid is supposed to be expelled through the birth canal during uterine contractions. That fluid doesn't get expelled, it sits in the lungs, and these babies are prone to pneumonia, respiratory distress, and asthma. Babies are also supposed to be exposed to the microbiome that exists in the birth canal. They don't get exposed to that. They're more likely to develop type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease, obesity, and because of all that fluid in the lungs, they have more difficulty with breastfeeding. How about hospitals? What's the incentive for hospitals to reduce C-section rates? We talked a little bit about the mandates that are coming up in 2020, but insurance companies have gone to blended reimbursement system where they decrease the financial incentive to do C-sections and increase the incentive to do normal vaginal deliveries. And vaginal deliveries are associated with a length of stay of 2 days, and C-sections are associated with a length of stay of 3 days. So hospitals have benefit and reason to decrease C-sections. And there's been a lot of press lately for hospitals that have high C-section rates. Just past July, Yelp decided that they're going to profile all California hospitals and their maternity rates. So hospitals that have high C-section rates are being shamed at the moment for their high C-section rates. And then how about employers? Do C-sections matter to you? And they do, because women who get C-sections end up taking more time off of work, on average an additional 2 weeks. They're less likely to come back to work, and they're more likely to have postpartum depression, which affects their performance. And because employers are so interested in providing the best quality care to their employees, companies like Kaiser promote their products on the value of the maternity care that they can provide to the employees. So 4 qualities of quality maternity care are early prenatal care, low C-section rates, screening for postpartum depression, and high breastfeeding rates. These are all techniques that insurance companies are using to sell their products to the employer. So we've talked about how fetal monitoring hasn't helped with outcomes, but actually hurt outcomes. What are some of the alternatives to fetal monitoring for detecting fetal distress? So there are a couple of them, none of which, in my opinion, are very good. The first one is Scalp pH, where you take blood from the baby's head to see if acidosis is forming. And you can imagine no one wants prick a needle into the baby's head multiple times during childbirth. The experience is traumatic enough. Recently, a company from Sweden came out with ST segment analysis. ST segment analysis looks at your heart rhythms and predicts cardiac ischemia. And they designed a product on the idea that if the heart isn't getting enough oxygen, well, maybe the brain isn't getting enough oxygen. So they look at the heart rhythms of the baby to see if that's a proxy for brain tissue oxygenation. And again, this is a device, I've got a little video here, that doesn't seem appealing in terms of how it's inserted. It's about a 30-second video. Yeah, you literally screw it into the baby's head. So that actually is the only device on the market to supplement fetal heart rate monitoring. There's nothing else currently on the market besides that device that I just showed. There was a device that came out in year 2000 developed by Nellcor. It was a fetal pulse oximeter that was attached to the baby's cheek, and it would tell you the baby's oxygen saturation on the theory that oxygen saturation is a better predictor of fetal distress than the heart rate. And the way that this technology works is it's based on the idea that blood with oxygen is red and blood without oxygen is blue, so they're doing a color analysis of the baby's blood, and they can quantify how much oxygen is in the blood based on the color. And this device was approved in the year 2000 by the FDA, and it actually reduced C-section rates for non-reassuring fetal heart rate tracings by 50%. But it increased C-section rates for dystocia by 2-fold. Dystocia means labor stopped progressing. It was a failure of progression of labor. And so labor stopped, and then women ended up getting a C-section rate for dystocia, and those rates went up by 200%. And if you look at the device, it's placed on the cheek. It's wedged in between the baby's head and the cervix. So there was a potentially mechanical obstruction that this device was causing. But in addition to dystocia, women complained of pain from the use of the device, and clinicians complained that the device interfered with cervical examination. So that device was pulled off the market in the year 2015 or 2005. So again, there's only one device right now on the market that's available for supplemental fetal monitoring, and that's the device that I showed you that needs to be screwed into the head. And one of the things that that device caused was it's called posterior occiput position. When a baby descends, not only are they descending, but they're rotating like a corkscrew. And if the baby's head fails to rotate, that's called a persistent posterior occiput position, the baby's head tends to get stuck. So you want your baby's head to rotate so the occiput, the back of the head, is up versus down. And the device, this device was causing posterior occiput posterior positioning. And that's why there's an increase of C-section rates for dystocia. So we at Raydiant Oximetry are developing a better fetal pulse oximeter. Instead of taking the vaginal route and attaching our device to the baby's cheek, we're placing a device on mom's abdomen. And we're doing it with a low form factor probe that looks like this, that uses LEDs and photodetectors. Our patented algorithm allows us to separate the maternal and fetal signal, and then we do a pulse oximetry calculation on the fetal pulse and get the same pulse oximetry number that Nellcore's device did. But because we're non-invasive, we don't think that we'll have the same issues with dystocia that their product had. We conducted a feasibility trial in 25 human patients at UC Davis Medical Center, and we've also tested our device on 3 pregnant sheep, and our results are 99% accurate. We're very pleased with how things have moved along, and we're happy that Citrus sponsored us to do our initial clinical trial. That was probably the biggest help when I look back at everything that Citrus has provided to us in terms of seed funding, mentoring through the Foundry program. The sponsorship of the clinical trial was immensely helpful. So we've only been around for 18 months. In 2016, we formed our company. We were able to form a working prototype and get a feasibility study conducted through Citrus Foundry. This year in 2017, we graduated from the Citrus Foundry. We won the Big Bang competition at UC Davis. We were 2017 Rosamond Innovators at UCSF. We got an SBIR grant from the NIH. We have an issued patent, and we've started our animal studies. We believe that at this rate, we'll be able to get through the FDA in 2019. We're currently raising a seed round to complete our product development, secure international patents, and meet with the FDA. And thank you for your interest in fetal monitoring and Raydiant Oximetry. Any questions?
We will have mics so that we can pick it up for our colleagues.
So I didn't know the subject was so interesting. It was great, especially when you brought the historical perspective and everything into. So what do you see as other technologies? I mean, you're focused on this particular thing, but what are some of the other technologies that you see that can be used in fetal monitoring? I mean, or for other things too, not just what you're focusing on. I mean, kind of as this whole biotechnology world starts evolving where we start monitoring things at a closer level.
Yeah, so there are lots of predictors of distress. You know, we look at cardiac distress. We look at acidosis formation by looking at the pH of the blood. We look at lactate formation. So all these are biomarkers that predict distress. The question is, how do you analyze these biomarkers in a non-invasive way? So if there's a way with Raman spectroscopy or near-infrared spectroscopy or some manner to quantify any of these biomarkers non-invasively, I think that's can not only be useful for fetal monitoring, but all of healthcare. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I actually have a question regarding your university work. In other words, when something comes from universities, usually the main goal is to publish. And so it's a question of versus to publish or to patent. And how do you maneuver around this? Can you explain a bit about if you did publishing your work in a scientific publication, or you just went directly for a patent? I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I've been withholding publications until I received our patent, and we didn't get our patent till September 12th, recently. We got our notice of allowance in July, and then the patent was issued in September. So I was intentionally withholding publications until I could protect our IP. I don't think they necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. You can do scholarly work and pursue the commercialization of a device. And I think that's something that this campus in particular has helped in terms of helping me understand that. So,
I have a general comment, and maybe it is a question in there. In information technology, in commercial information technology, I cannot think of any case where there was going to be a market gap for 20 years before somebody jumps in with a better technology to fill it. And you described a very credible situation where the existing technology has been languishing for a long time before something else came along. Can you comment on that? I mean, is this field inherently more conservative, or there are barriers to innovation that we do not experience in commercial information technology?
yes, so you know the road for medical device development is long, and then you have the FDA involved, and that adds a risk to investors, and it's a risk that they necessarily don't want to have to undertake, and they frankly feel that they could invest in something else and get a bigger exit and much quicker return. But obviously there's a need here. And then I think we're also playing in the women's healthcare space where there have historically been a lot of disparities. When you look at innovation for heart care, for stroke care, for orthopedics, for prostate, these are things that easily get funded, but women's healthcare products and pediatric healthcare products tend not to get funded so easily. So I'm in a space where it's not very attractive to investors, and I'm in a space that's historically been despaired. So that makes it doubly hard to get funding and get things going, and that's why we have such a gap. You know, 50-year-old technology that's still being used.
So can you comment on the origins of this disparity?
See that again?
Can you comment on this disparity a little bit?
Yeah. So, you know, there are gender disparities in healthcare, and there are racial disparities, and then there are disparities associated with poverty. And I can give you guys a link. It's called Unequal Motherhood. You can Google it. It's about a 50-page research thesis, Unequal Motherhood. But it talks about some of the disparities that exist in maternity care in the United States. You know, so for example, a woman of African American descent is twice as likely to get a C-section rate, but 3 times more likely, I don't remember the exact number, 3 or 5 times more likely to have a complication from a C-section than a non-African American woman. And women of poverty tend to get more C-sections, and women whose first language isn't English tend to get more C-sections, and they tend to do worse from it as well. And some of these, you know, is it access to care? Is it discrimination? It's hard to tease out why these things happen, but they definitely happen, and it's something we all need to think about as we, you know, go through our development process.
Neil, we have more questions, but could you elaborate on, we have a number of researchers here, potential startups and actual startups who are working and know they will have to go through the FDA procedure. Could you elaborate on that? I know you're right in the middle of it, and discuss some of the challenges, but the opportunities and what our current environment is for that, because it's a major issue for a lot of companies to really be able to succeed.
For sure. So I always thought of the FDA as a hurdle, you know, a barrier to getting your device out on the market. But I've sort of changed the way I've thought about it, having been at the Fogarty Institute and talking to other medical device companies. And so one of the things that investors want to know when you commercialize is, can you protect your core technology? And IP does give you a means of protecting your core technology, but it's not the best way to protect your core technology, because ultimately, if someone steals your core technology, you have to have the resources to sue them and go after them in court. And that's just not feasible for a startup. So the fact that I have these patents doesn't really keep me from, keep GE or, a big medical device company from infringing on our IP. But the FDA provides a regulatory barrier to entry that you can take advantage of if you're smart about it. Because the GEs, the Philips, they can't just go and start selling your device until they get through the FDA. So the FDA has become a lot more startup friendly in terms of getting devices out to the market, especially devices that have been perceived as non-invasive and having an unmet clinical need. Currently, the turnaround time at the FDA is about 120 days, and it used to be anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So the FDA is changing the way they do business, and they're working with startups more than they used to. And their interest is protecting the population. They're not necessarily trying to keep you from getting to market, but make sure that what you're offering does protect the public. And so I've really learned recently that to think of them as a friend rather than a foe. And I think so.
We have is the mic down, please?
I did a hybrid trip oximeter in 1973, and by now I'm sure it has gone through many revolutions and small tips. So why is it not possible to use a hybrid tip oximeter with red and infrared sensors to take it through the catheter, the blood path, venous, and measure right at the mother's connection to the baby, the information of the blood, the child's blood?
So that would be possible, but the problem is you would only access the baby's head, and a lot of babies have hair, and melanin tends to absorb a lot of these light. And also, you would need the cervix to dilate and the baby to descend before you can actually start monitoring.
No, I was thinking of going to a mother's blood path.
Going through mother's blood, like.
Yeah, the hybrid tip oximeter is actually going to the catheter. The tip itself is going to the catheter, and it measures and send information back, the red and infrared.
So would that be for fetal oximetry or maternal oximetry?
It is for maternal, but then what I was wondering was, everything is supplied to the fetus through the maternal path, right? I mean, there is a path that goes to the fetus is not directly connected to, I mean, it is
right.
Getting its supply, oxygen supply and everything through the blood path from the mother only, right?
I think you would have to go very deep to where the placental interface is, and it would no longer be non-significant risk. It would be a device of significant risk. Is it possible? Yes. Does it have a commercial viability? That's for the market to tell. So thanks.
All right. Thank you again for sharing this incredible innovation. So I have like 2 questions. The first is about, when you say you have this algorithm to separate, the rates, and is it more of a pattern recognition algorithm or more, machine learning type of deep learning type of algorithm that you can, get from past, data, or is it more of, unsupervised learning or some sort of other algorithm? And also, when you reach 99% accuracy, what does that mean, like in terms of decreasing, C-section rate and in the real world? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so our we don't have any machine learning capabilities currently in our prototype, but I think that's a great idea, and would love to learn how I can incorporate machine learning into our technology. In terms of 99% accuracy, so when I say that, that comes down to identifying the baby's heart rate and the baby's oxygen saturation, and those are results we can confirm with blood gas samples, blood gases from the baby. In terms of decreasing C-section rates, we're not at that level yet. So we haven't actually done a prospective study on laboring women using our device to see if we could reduce C-section rates. That's after we get to the market. Right now we just want to do the product development and get through the FDA and get to the market, and then we'll do the study to see if we can improve C-section rates.
And Mark, for your market, where do you, or Neil, do you anticipate, what are the channels that you think will be the greatest for those who are considering this? Insurance, again, physician groups, et cetera.
Yeah, so selling to hospitals is difficult because your end user isn't necessarily your purchaser, right? You've got a lot of people's hands in the pot. You've got to make this attractive to insurance companies, malpractice insurance companies, hospitals, hospital systems, physicians, nurses, the patients, right? They all have a role in deciding if our product is going to be used and be supported. So, but we think that we have a great story to tell insurance companies. We think we have a great story we can tell hospital systems, obstetricians, women, pregnant women, right? I think we can fire on all cylinders and make something that's attractive to everyone. But in terms of the purchasers, it comes down to the hospitals and the insurance companies.
You're describing an amazing innovation, but I think it's one of three, and I'm wondering about the other two. So one is to actually get the signal of the heart rate, the fetal heart rate, separate it, know what it is, not just the rate, but the variation in that rate. The second is the interpretation of that variation. It's the pattern recognition, or however you want to do it, because it's not just the decelerations, but it's what kinds of decelerations. Is it one? Is it many? Et cetera. And then the third is, what do you do with that information? I mean, in some places, you do a C-section, no matter what it is. That's part of the problem. So I'm wondering if you're looking at those second two innovations at all.
Absolutely, and what you described, the second and third innovations, where the money is, right? That's where the big impact is going to be. But I have to do this, I have to think of this as a marathon, right? I have to just get through the first stage, then the second stage. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
This is a question from Twitter. Preg Scientist wants to know, will you be able to share the sources you cite in your presentation?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can give my email to everyone, and feel free to contact me.
Do we have any final questions? Well, will you join me in thanking Neil for an outstanding program? And again, we're so thrilled that you're the perfect poster guy for Citrus. Congratulations again.
Thank you.